like here, instead of treating that subject of reparations like prisoners of war or war crimes, they treat it like plain old run-of-the-mill ordinary slavery, which when you study in your history books, you'll see that this wasn't light slavery. Study your history books, you'll see. Uh, this was war against a people's sovereignty. They went and kidnapped a lot of these people. Some of the people, black people, they bought were prisoners of war anyway that were sold off. And so those African kings that sold the black man off, black woman off, didn't have any idea that it was a different type of slavery. But a lot of the black man and black woman were kidnapped, forced against their will. And so it's an act of aggression, an act of war. Dred Scott, in his case, they said it was like a civil rights case. It wasn't no civil rights. It was a human right. But they didn't want any black man. They tried to just, put it into one particular subject of the southern states and northern states, but it was all the states. Because when you got a Supreme Court involved, Supreme Court decision involved, it's talking about all the states. And they said that a black man can never be a citizen. Then they try to sugarcoat it over by just, the white man, he very technical. He try to find a loophole where he could prove his point, get his point across, so he can keep you blinded, deaf, dumb, and blind in the dark, because you think he got a nice, lovable streak in him. No, he don't. Not when it comes to terms of the black man being equal to him or superior to him in any kind of way, form, or fashion. You don't want to say he even came from you. And then if he does recognize that he come from you, he calls you primitive, and he calls himself the new man, which everybody want to be like. He's a status symbol for the planet to follow in his eyes. So he uses, talking about the Caucasian, European Caucasian, a language called legalese, and the color of law. And every black lawyer in America studies under the system of the European. So they can't argue the case anyway. We are what you call citizen subject. Subject means under the authority or control of another. Citizens, a member of state or a nation who owes allegiance to it by birth or naturalization, and is entitled to certain rights as the right to vote. Now, that language there is devastating because it says entitled to certain right as the right to vote. But in the Constitution, it says you have an inalienable right. We'll get into that later. But pertaining to black people, it's mostly a citizen, member of a state or nation who owes his allegiance to that state. Period. But they throw in by birth in there or naturalization. And what category does the black man fall in since he's really the enemy of the state? Black man is the enemy of the state. But they don't say this out loud. He's a subject, a citizen subject under the authority or control of another. That's why the police officers tell you got to obey their commands. It ain't like you in control of them by you paying your taxes. By you being black, they don't distinguish one black person from another. They don't distinguish if you are a Christian or a Muslim. They don't distinguish if you are a upright, law-abiding citizen or a criminal. They don't distinguish none of that because you are the enemy of the state, which is quietly hidden from you because they want you to go on thinking so you could bill for them and work for free. They want you to keep on thinking that you are supposed to have equal rights under the law. But if that was the case, why you gotta have a civil rights bill viewed every 10 years? They look at that bill to see if they want to keep you as keep giving you your civil rights. Black people are made citizens by subjugate to bring under control or have been conquered. So they told you the Supreme Court that Dred Scott can never be a citizen of the United States. A black man can never be a citizen. They haven't never really made that. If they changed it or didn't mean it like that, they didn't never specifically indicate the change, in that. Same with the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment. The language still remains the same. But when it comes down to you have a right to bear arms, it just gets real technical. It gets real difficult. You got to argue that point because they don't want their people. They want to keep their people armed, and disarm the black man. But the only time they let the black man have arms is for gangs and corruption, and so they could kill up each other, just like they did the Indians. Same game they played on the Indians. You would see it in the old cowboy movies or western movies that a gun runner would supply Indians with guns so the army can come in and wipe them out. All this is war act. Same way they doing with the Middle Eastern nations. They supply certain Middle Eastern nations like Saudi Arabia with arms and soldiers, military training and so forth. And so they could fight. Now these is Muslims fighting other Muslims, right? Shiites fighting Sunni and so forth. So that's how they work psychology. So it's a psychological warfare as well as what they call spiritual warfare. The reason why they call it spiritual warfare is really psychological warfare, but spiritual warfare, that which you cannot see, like a ghost or a spirit. That's how they using that word spiritual warfare, because it's hidden, and psychological the same way is really a tricking of the minds, but they're using different language like legalese and language that you think that you are equal, you know, but the politicians, those that are black, they're not fighting for equal rights. They're not fighting for equal rights. They're fighting to keep a job. They're fighting to have a job. Just like the preacher, he if it wasn't no corruption and sin, he wouldn't have a job. Same with the politicians. They're fighting to have a job. So long as they can keep up some type of argument in the courts, in the politics, they say they representing the people, but they're not. They're representing themselves. And this Constitution, freedom of speech and all like that, everything is censored. You are being watched all the time, and you can only say certain things. Like you can't say certain things about who they say is Semitic. You can't say certain things about homosexuals, and so they just changed the language as far as saying things about black people and minorities, what they call minorities. You could talk about them, but they have code languages for the black man. As long as you stay within that code, you could rag on them, throw shade on them. This is Black Light. Stay tuned.